Hi, I'm Ed Amoroso from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with a longtime friend of mine, Sami Saydjari, who is the CEO of Cyber Defense Agency. Sami, welcome to New York.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to be here.
Now, I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about cybersecurity because you've been doing this for a long time.
Forever.
I bet 20, 30 years, right?
35.
Yeah, go figure, right? It goes fast when you're having fun.
Absolutely.
Let's go back to the early days. You were involved in cybersecurity as this discipline was being created. What kind of differentiated it then from now? Like, what was it like doing cyber back in maybe the 80s or so?
It was the hardest problem on the block. So I entered into research, and my goal was to work on really, really hard problems. And computer security, as it was called at the time, was the hardest problem that the government had. They couldn't figure out how to approach it. It had all sorts of interesting aspects in both electrical engineering and computer science, two of my favorite topics. And so cybersecurity was the thing I wanted to focus on.
Where were you working in government at the time?
I was working for the National Security Agency at the time, the National Computer Security Center, which was a subpart of the NSA at the time.
Now, tell me, what's the story there? I always thought NCSC was a great idea, and Pat Gallagher running it, and then it just sort of went away. What happened? With then the Rainbow series and so on, what happened there?
Well, so in order to do the national mission, which is trying to figure out how to make computers more secure, not just in the Defense Department, but across the country, they had to kind of create a more outward-facing entity because the NSA was much more of a inward, classified, secret kind of organization, and the mission was different than that. And so they kind of created a arm's length organization that was sort of part of the agency but not really part of the agency. And so that was the National Computer Security Center. Right. And it developed a series of standards, the Orange Book, the Yellow Book, the Green Book, the Rainbow series, as you call it, all outstanding documents that are still useful today. And then an evaluation discipline, which became an accreditation discipline, how do you know that systems are secure? And then a research arm that really helped push forward the research in cybersecurity that still guides things that work today and guides my knowledge.
Why didn't it keep going?
That's a very good question. I think ultimately it rolled back into NSA culture. I think what they realized was that there was really two cultures. There was the computer security culture and there was the communication security culture. And the communication security culture had been around longer and was really around cryptography, whereas the computer security was the new kids on the block and was very computer science and bigger system oriented. And so they merged those two because they realized that a system was a system of both. And so there was sort of a mergers and acquisitions kind of thing inside the government, and the two cultures clashed, merged, and then became information security and eventually cybersecurity, and kind of turned a bit inward, not quite as outward facing as it used to be.
You think the internet, as it evolved into an e-commerce kind of base with the World Wide Web and some kind of mid-90s, did that in some sense have a big impact on cybersecurity, the progression, do you think?
Massive. Right. I think back in the day where I joined it, computers were mainframe systems that were connected by internet, and a few major centers were connected. And the primary problem was defending classified information from disclosure. Right now, it's all of commerce. Right, it's all of our infrastructure, power grid, banking, all depends on cybersecurity. So it completely changed the nature of the game. It now is the heart of what we have to worry about today in commerce, not just e-commerce.
Well, let's take it to the present. I know you mentioned power systems and so on. That's a big problem. Is it possible to underestimate the consequence of a massive nation state, or even just a coordinated attack on infrastructure that supports people and life and safety? Is it possible to underestimate that?
It's hard to underestimate it. I mean, so I think in general, there have been about 5 major reports: Defense Science Board report, National Academy of Sciences, you name Presidential Commission report, all of which have said there's a massive vulnerability here to this infrastructure, and it is a little unusual in that it is the primary target of a cyber attack for if somebody were involved in a nation-state level war. And so these systems, in my mind, the power grid, telecommunications, banking, and oil and gas are sort of the four most critical of all the critical infrastructures, because all the other ones depend on that. And these infrastructures are highly dependent on computers and on computer security. And so this represents the heart, I think, of the nation's first worldliness, right? And so this becomes an extremely important vulnerability and extremely important strategic interest, I think, for the nation to face
Is
up
that
to.
the issue? Like when you and I were a couple of kids, the power grid was controlled from a big factory with big switches on the wall and not connected to anything.
Right.
And now it's kind of connected to the internet more or less.
Yes.
Like it's not like you go to a website and you click here and you turn power on or off, but maybe to a hacker, is it that easy? Like can you get on the internet and go touch somebody's power infrastructure?
Well, yes and no, right? So I think 30 or 40 years ago, it was dedicated hardware on
Right.
very limited connections to each other. They really didn't need to interconnect much. The power transmission lines were connected, but the computers really weren't, because there wasn't a need for a lot of coordination. But with deregulation, now everybody has to connect to everybody to coordinate. It's sort of like just-in-time manufacturing, sort of just-in-time electricity. And these interconnections require a lot of communications and a lot of sort of co-risk taking when you do that. And now, so first of all, they began to connect a lot, which made them vulnerable. And then they then wanted to reach out to the consumer, right, to extend their just-in-time electrical power out to the edge, to the consumer, which is smart grid is the term we use today. Right. And now they must be on the internet, right? And so now every home is connected both as a sensor and as a controller. They can do both directions. And so this creates even a higher vulnerability. So as we progress, we're getting more vulnerable because we're becoming more interconnected.
Yeah.
There's tremendous pressure to interconnect. There's a lot of advantages to it. Right, there's an economic advantage, there's a strategic advantage, but it also creates more and more vulnerability. And it's a tragedy of the commons, right? Because we all will suffer if that attack happens.
That connectivity allows like Detroit to buy power from Miami and store it.
Right,
So,
and it allows hundreds, if not thousands, of producers. I have a solar power set of panels on my roof. I am an official generator.
Saves a ton of money, doesn't it?
It does save a ton of money,
Yeah.
but I have to be connected to the grid, you know, and I have to be able to feedback and say, you know, what's going on. So now we have thousands of generation stations, including me. Right?
Yeah, go figure. Hey, tell me about Cyber Defense Agency. You've been at it for a little while. Are you guys been? Do I have it right? Few years now.
Yeah. So I think it's about 10 years old, maybe
Go
now.
figure.
So I started out in the government doing research and development, security architectures for very difficult systems that a lot of people want to attack. Defense Department kind of systems. Right. And I got a lot of great experience doing that, but I wanted to kind of come out and work for a broader base, including the commercial sector. And so I thought the best way to do that was to step out into a consultancy that could work for the national security community, but also for banking and also for power grids and other kinds of people that needed those services. So that's what caused me to step out into this consultancy.
What are some project areas that you like to work in?
I love working on two things. One is pushing the state-of-the-art forward, so research and development. So we work with organizations like DARPA to figure out like how to defend against flash worms, for example. And I also love applying the state-of-the-art to advanced architectures. So figuring out how to defend real systems that are really under attack. How do you take that technology and weave it together in such a way that's an effective defense against real adversaries who really understand how to attack systems.
That's great. Now you've written a book recently,
Yes,
which I think is fantastic.
Thank you.
I wrote you a nice review. I popped it on the internet.
I appreciate
Well,
it.
what's the name of the book?
Engineering Trustworthy Systems.
Yeah, it's a big book, right?
Yes, sorry.
Take you a long time?
If I had more time, I would have written a shorter book. Yeah, no, I actually started out to write a 250-page book, but it turned into a 500-page book because there's so much to say about it.
I strongly recommend it. I think it's pretty comprehensive. You cover a lot of different topics in the book. I think very few people, other than you, maybe have the perspective, both present and historical, to write such a thing. I thought it was great.
I appreciate that. I mean, depth was what the book was really all about. I mean, it's both depth and breadth, right?
Yeah.
And so the principles that could have cross-cut all of cybersecurity, because I've been involved in research, development, operations. I've been involved in all phases of over 35 years. Principles begin to emerge. Both principles that were taught to me by my mentors and principles that just evolved over time as I've been a practitioner. And so I wanted to share those ideas with all of my colleagues and particularly the next generation. So I just kept writing until I had nothing further to say.
I guess that's the algorithm, right? Until the pen stops.
Exactly.
Ship it off. Let's talk threat. So when we first started, the threat was a bunch of dopey kids, defacing computers and were breaking into networks and stuff, usually without serious malicious intent. Would you agree? It was probably more vandalism.
Yeah,
in the
I mean,
early days.
certainly in the non-military world. It's the military always worried about the cyber attackers, right?
Fair point.
There's always been sort of the military intelligence world that that wanted to go after the cyberspace of the other person, whether it was the big mainframes or even the PCs.
Fair point.
There's always been two classes of adversaries. The nation-state adversary, which has always been sophisticated and well-resourced, and this other set, right, which is exactly as you characterized. The kids who were just kind of looking to do cool stuff and prove that they could find a cool vulnerability and exploit it, just to show that they could, not really to gain anything from it, other than notoriety.
Tell me if this metaphor makes sense. In the 30 years ago, the nation-state cyber problem was like a tennis ball. The commercial problem was like a grape. And now they're both beach balls?
Yeah.
Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I would even say that the commercial problem is bigger.
Maybe bigger. Yeah.
Because the military had almost exclusively the problem because they had the most computers, interconnected computers, and the most to lose because of the confidentiality of the information. Now the commercial side depends so heavily on computers. I would say that if you looked at the risk exposure to the country, if you aggregate the wealth that was at stake from a cyber attack, it's far larger against the commercial sector than the public sector right now, because there's so much in cyberspace that's in the private sector.
You think destructive malware is the next kind of fearful kind of thing?
Yeah, destructive malware, well, ransomware is sort of a first instance of that.
When I mean destructive, I mean something that impedes your ability to complete your mission, something that just knocks you out.
Yeah, I think...
Takes computers out, takes networks
That
out.
worries me a lot.
Yeah.
I would say sophisticated malware, self-propagating worms and viruses that have sophisticated missions, and I would say that's one of the sophisticated missions.
Stuxnet.
Yeah, so sabotage, right. Sabotage worries me a little bit more than espionage. Those are sort of the two broad categories.
Sabotage means with insider participation.
It could, but sabotage really means undermining the mission of the system, right?
Okay.
So damaging, kind of like what you said, like damaging malware that really interferes in somebody's ability to do something. We still are losing on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars to espionage, right? To places like China who want to steal intellectual property to gain research and development advantage. There's still espionage going on, and it kind of bleeds us slowly, right? It's a death by 1,000 cuts. But sabotage worries me a bit more because you infiltrate either through a life cycle attack where somebody gets into the software development cycles and pushes in a piece of malicious code that is a sleeper, stays asleep until they want to activate it, and then could damage the power grid, bring the power grid down. That's what keeps me up at night.
Let me ask you a philosophical sort of design question. When you think root cause, when someone says, hey, Sammy, you've been at this, at all these threats. Why is everything so insecure? What's the reason? Is it software? Is it people? Is it the perimeter architecture? Is it something else? What pops to mind for you as kind of the root cause at a deeper level?
That's a wonderful question. You're the first person ever asked me that.
Well, you're somebody who I'm sure has an answer to that. you think deep thoughts. What do you think?
So I think the problem is was who pays for the consequences of risks,
Yeah.
right? So software developers are sloppy on average, and there's no real incentive for them to become
They're
less
kind
sloppy.
of rushed, right?
Yeah, right. Time to market's everything,
It's a
right?
bit
So I'm
rush the
not
stuff out.
saying they're stupid, right? I'm saying that they're sloppy because time to market pressures are
Yeah.
huge,
Yeah.
and it's a competitive advantage to get a sloppier product out
Right.
and then fix it.
Right.
And so there's a lot of pressure. And then when something goes terribly wrong, they can't get sued, right? Because the end user agreement says you agree to not sue them, right? And so there's an externalization of this risk to the commons, right? And so we're all kind of paying for that risk. And nothing terrible has happened yet. You know, it's painful. We've had multi-million-dollar attacks, but we've survived them. It's sort of, it's the cost of doing business from the perspective of the banks, for example. But we all know, people who have been in the field a long time, who have worked the offensive side, know that the potential of these damages are orders of magnitude larger than that. We just haven't seen them come to reality. We will. And when they happen, they're going to be really devastating. And the people who are designing software today, who don't have a incentive to make it better, they're not going to pay the price. All of us are going to pay the price. So it's a tragedy of the commons, I think, is really the way I'd put it, is that software's kind of in the commons, right? You can't really sue people. They don't take responsibility. But when a bad event happens, we are all going to suffer, and it won't be clear who to go sue because we're all going to be in such pain.
We have that challenge, you and I and people in our community, of seeing the simplicity and straightforwardness of these cascading attacks. We both know how to do it. We've lived in and around offense. And when we say, like you just did, attack, when it does happen, it's going to be bad. A lot of times on the other side, people are going, oh, here they go again, the security guys.
Yep.
Oh, for God's... Well, if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. Does that drive you nuts a little bit? It drives me because I think, man, I'm so tired for decades of going, oh my gosh, it looks like it would be so easy to take these things out. And then somehow we muddle through each year without like these massive catastrophes yet. I mean, are you thinking along the same lines? You find that frustrating?
A little frustrating, but I also,
Not that we're wishing for something bad to happen.
No, but so for example, I don't advocate that people fix every possible theoretical problem.
Yeah,
Part of what I advocate for in the book, for example, is a balanced approach where you have to understand what's at stake. You have to understand the likelihood of it happening, and just like you do in buildings, right, where you do certain things in a building to make it fire resistant, and then you ensure the residual risk. Same thing is true in cyberspace. You have to build your cyberspace safely, but not so safely that you can't use the system, or not so safely that it costs so much to build the system you can't perform your mission. So I'm definitely in the category of balance. But on the other hand, when you look at nation-state attacks against infrastructure, that's where it crosses the threshold, where that's not a balance between what the company can afford and the attack. This is now a societal risk, and we have to treat that a little differently, I think. And I think we have to look at society subsidizing those risks in some smart way.
So a lot of people watching our video right now who do enterprise security for a living, like protect some bank or civilian agency or even a small company. If you have a couple of dollars extra to spend on cybersecurity, what would be your advice? Should it be adding some things, taking some things away, buying something, training people? How would you spend your couple of dollars extra?
I think the biggest problem is people don't know how to spend the dollars, right? And so I think the right way to invest the dollars is to figuring out how to spend the dollars.
Yeah.
So in my mind, risk assessment, which is where I would invest, because here's why. So if I spend my $2 extra, right, or however many I have on risk assessment, it gives me the power to understand the stakes and what is really at risk, right? I could pay a red team. All right, I think my system is fantastic. Tell me differently, right? A red team comes in and they say, here's how I'm going to take your bank down completely, right? I'm going to steal $100 million from you next week. Oh, okay. Well, now I understand as a CEO or CIO of the bank, I now understand truly, right? We all tend to be optimists that, our organizations are great and we must be doing this right because I hired this fantastic CSO, right, or CISO, and so it must be good because I'm paying them a lot of money, right? And so it's a surprise. We tend to be overly optimistic about how good our defenses are. So a risk assessment, I think, is a very refreshing, clear picture that says, really, no kidding, forget all of this, what you like to believe about yourself or your institution. No kidding, this is the reality. Hold up a mirror, this is really what you look like, right? And so then that gives them the information they need to make the proper investments. Where is the risk coming from? Do I invest it in firewalls or intrusion detection or a combination or smarter operators? You'll figure that out through a risk assessment.
I can see why you've been in business for 10 years. That was very lucid. We have that on tape, so put that on your website. That's a pretty good sales pitch for risk assessment. Hopefully people will use that. Well, listen, I want to thank you for coming to visit New York.
You're
It's
welcome.
so nice to see you. I know you have your wife here with us this weekend, so it's great to see you. And thanks for sharing. I hope people buy your book.
Me too. Thank you very
Sandy,
much.
it's
I
so
appreciate
nice
it.
to see you. Thanks. And we will see you next time.